3D printing is set to transform manufacturing, and it seems it may do the same for the medical field. University researchers and private companies are starting to use 3D printers to build living things using cell-based inks. It could mean the power to revolutionize the availability of human organs and tissue. Keith Murphy is CEO of Organovo. Great to have you with us.
Thanks, Amanda.
Well, let's start with where the technology is now, because it sounds like something right out of science fiction, and I know it's moving at a really quick pace. Where are we with it?
Well, it's early days, but you're absolutely right. It is moving very quickly. What we're able to do today is take cells as a cellular ink, and we actually create up this ink, place it in 3 dimensions using a robotic bioprinter. We layer it, just like in 3D printing, where they layer plastic materials, we layer the cells, and what results is a living human tissue.
So let's explain this to viewers, because I've come to realize that 3D printing is misunderstood by many people, particularly investors.
Yeah.
Basically, this is a technology that emerged from crude inkjet technology a decade ago. This is basically spraying cells, ink, plastics into a 3D shape. Is that exactly what's happening?
Well, there's a few different ways you can do it. One is actually to take, yes, an inkjet-based printer and spray cells. To make a thicker tissue, it's actually better to start with a block of cells, a very tiny building block that's a cell aggregate, if you will. So thousands of cells merged together. And in that sense, it works like a Lego block. And then the printer actually places that down. You place many of those into a matrix that's pre-designed using a CAD, a computer-aided design, and then you can actually create an architecture that's like a tissue.
So how far are we, Keith, from a day when we can actually create a liver to transplant into somebody or a heart to transplant into somebody?
Well, today what we can do is create very tiny pieces of these organs. So Organovo announced in April that we had developed an initial 3D liver tissue. It's very small, but it has something very different from what we've had before in biological research. It has that 3-dimensional characteristic. So it's about 0.5 millimeter thick to 1 millimeter thick, but that allows it to be and behave much more like liver does in the body than just liver cells on a petri dish do alone. Those fail in about 2 days, and we've already shown about 3 times that, the activity 3 times that long in our livers that are just tissues. Now, over time, we can make these things thicker and thicker, but we have to overcome certain limitations of the technology as we move things forward.
So the question is, most of us neophytes know that a liver can survive losing a piece of it and it grows itself back. Is there ever going to be a time when you can actually make enough of this with a 3D printer that it can be put into the body and it grows itself to a full-size liver that's functional?
So Kevin, that's a great observation, and I like to think that liver is going to be one of the first tissues we can get to organs for transplant with, precisely for the reason that you state, which is that liver cells have an internal programming that allows them to regrow. So if a doctor, takes out half of a human liver to transplant it to a donor or to a patient who needs it from a donor, the donor's tissue will regrow. So what Organovo does by layering the tissues in 3D, we really take advantage of the same cellular programming. If you put the cells in the right position outside the body, give them the right environment, they have the internal programming to keep growing, to keep acting like a 3D tissue. So there's a real opportunity here to leverage that, and I think liver will be the first technology. But there's a lot of limitations that we have before we get there. First and foremost, today we can't yet build blood vessel networks inside of the organs. So in our bodies, the blood vessel system, the circulatory system, serves to get oxygen to each and every cell in the body. Today, we can't build those blood vessel networks, so we need to be able to do that first before we can make tissue that's thicker than 1 millimeter.
And I imagine that there may be some other roadblocks between here and actually generating organs, and those will be more social ones, I think. What are the kind of legal and ethical barriers between that sort of end goal and where we are today?
Well, we like to think we break down a lot of those barriers if we get to success. I mean, one thing to think about today is when there is an organ for transplant available, somebody's making a decision about who gets that. So there's often questions about whether or not someone properly received an organ and was waiting on the transplant list long enough or took some sort of advantage there. We think there's a time coming far in the future where you get past those kind of ethical decisions because you can make a liver or another organ from a patient's own cells.
So give us a time frame, because let's say you have liver cancer, which is obviously a terror to people. It's almost a death sentence. Could this be used to save somebody in that situation? And how many years away are we? I realize it's a crystal ball for you, but give us, is it in a generation, 2 generations? If you got cancer, would you save yourself with this one day? What'll happen?
Well, it's a great question, and I think the best way to think about it is not in terms of how many years, but how many people years, right? How many people are nations putting on this in terms of research? How much funding is going towards it? If we had $1 billion going into this field, you know, things would move a lot more quickly. If someone took the Apollo moonshot and said, well, I'm going to dedicate the entire resources of multiple nations to this and get it done, you know, it would happen very quickly. But I think it's decades away short of that. What we can do in the shorter term, though, and Organovo has this as part of our business plan, today what we're working on is simpler tissues that we can move forward into clinical studies in a much smaller number of years. Things like blood vessels, things like heart muscle patches instead of a full heart. These are things we can already build with the current technology of the 3D bioprinter, and you can put those through animal studies, take them into clinical studies in a shorter term.
All right, not a lot of time, Keith, just 30 seconds, but how are you making money? What's the profit model here?
Well, today what we do is actually build these tissues, very small, like I said, like liver, use them for toxicology studies, use them as disease models that can actually replace animal models in drug discovery. So pharma companies, about 40% of the money they spend goes to drugs that never make it to the market because they fail. They are essentially rolling the dice because they don't have human biological data when they move into clinical studies, which are very expensive. By using a human tissue outside the body, you get better understanding in a research setting before you move forward on a drug. You can pick better drugs and save those costs.
All right, great to have you here,
and
Keith.
So we get our money. Thank you very much.
Sorry about that. Keith Murphy, CEO of... No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, so we get our funding and our revenues today from those interactions, from partnership deals with these pharma companies, and that's the source of our revenues today.
All right. Keith, great to have you here.
Thank you very much, Amanda.
Keith Murphy, CEO of Organovo.